Good morning and welcome to Rising. Thank you for joining us on this Tuesday morning. We've got another news-filled show for you today, and I am joined by Max Burns, who's filling in. Thank you for being on the show today.
Robby, thanks so much for having me. What a wild week in politics. I cannot wait to dig into this with you.
Yes, lots to talk about. We're going to start with the Supreme Court ruling. So, of course, as you know by now, the Supreme Court ruled on presidential immunity on Monday, setting Washington, D.C. on fire. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court ruled Monday that former presidents have at least some immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts, but not for unofficial acts or private acts. Now, in an effort to change the narrative from his disastrous debate performance, President Biden took to a podium to address the decision last night. Let's listen to what he said.
You also face moments where you need the wisdom to respect the limits of the power of the office of the presidency. This nation was founded on the principle that there are no kings in America. Each of us is equal before the law. No one is above the law, not even the President of the United States. With today's Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, that fundamentally changed. For all practical purposes, today's decision almost certainly means that there are virtually no limits on what a president can do.
Now, SCOTUS's ruling means Trump might be shielded from prosecution for criminal charges relating to his alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Now, if those actions are deemed to have been official or part of his constitutional duties, then they might be immune from prosecution. Writing for the majority, conservative Chief Justice Roberts maintained that, quote, if a former president's official acts are routinely subjected to scrutiny in criminal prosecutions, the independence of the executive branch may be significantly undermined if they're not protected. Writing for the liberal wing of the court, Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote, the ruling is, quote, a mockery of the principles foundational to our Constitution that no man is above the law. The January 6th case against Trump is now in some jeopardy. The ruling will likely delay trials in other cases as well, rendering them unlikely before November, certainly. Trump lawyers are already talking about getting the 34 felony counts in the hush money case in Manhattan dismissed.
Meanwhile, progressive Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez announced Monday that she's filing articles of impeachment against at least one justice over their immunity ruling. She took to X, writing, quote, the Supreme Court has become consumed by a corruption crisis beyond its control. Today's ruling represents an assault on American democracy. It's up to Congress to defend our nation from this authoritarian capture. It's unclear how many and which of the justices she would target.
So obviously, people are freaking out, hair on fire, panic in liberal media, Democratic circles. I should say I also have some qualms about this ruling for sure. I don't want presidents, Trump or Biden or anyone, to have like unlimited authority to do whatever they want and face no consequences. Like, I get it. I have that concern too. This is not the way I wanted this decision to rule, not because of anything having to do with Trump, just because of the important constitutional principle. That said, I think the reaction has been a little bit hysterical. They didn't say that he is in all circumstances shielded from any potential criminal inquiry, just that there has to be a distinction between these official acts and unofficial acts. And then under the official acts, there's a subcategory where it's presumed he would have immunity, but he might not. And so on. So you think there's a little bit of too much panic going on here?
Well, I think under any read of this decision, this is an expansion of the conception of presidential immunity. I mean, in the state dining room, there is a quote from John Adams that says, may only honest and wise men govern under these doors. Now, that was initially a blessing, but now it seems more like a warning because, as Joe Biden said, really the only limit now on what a president can do is that president's personal conception of his own power. Now, what shocked me is that Joe Biden seems to be the least concerned about all of this. His message was go out and vote to make sure Donald Trump doesn't win. Now, that puts a lot on voters, while sort of removing any necessity to take advantage of this situation from members of Congress, from the president himself. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez now seems to be about the only person who really gets that this is an opportunity for Democrats to make a case against a historically unpopular Supreme Court that not only supermajorities of Democrats, but also independents loathe. And meanwhile, we have our elected officials on the Senate judiciary in the White House essentially saying we're going to tie a hand behind our backs and just use a very limited conception of this ruling and hope everything goes to plan.
Well, I mean, I think doing what AOC recommends would be pretty norm-shattering itself, to just go after the Supreme Court in an FDR sort of style coup would, I think, be a difficult argument to make. At the same time, they're saying, oh, Trump is shattering all these norms. Oh, he's a threat to democracy. You don't like a Supreme Court decision, we're going to start, I don't know, having inquiries into the members of the Supreme Court. Now, what Democrats could, of course, do, and they're just repeating the whole RBG experience here. It seems pretty clear that Sonia Sotomayor has been discussed to be in not terrific health necessarily. I've seen conversations from some Democrats wondering why there isn't more pressure on her to step down, while it's still possible for a Democratic president to make her to announce her replacement and have that person confirmed by a Democratic Senate. That chance is very likely to be gone in just a few months, and yet you're not hearing a lot of that. That would be something they could do. I mean, not to have a pickup on the Supreme Court, but to stop it from moving in a further direction from Democrats. But Democrats in this moment seem just totally unwilling to do to play real politics or do the things they need to maintain their power, as they are for now sticking with Joe Biden, as far as I can tell.
No, that's absolutely right, and it's incredibly frustrating. I mean, the Democrats' message on this seems to be, let's hope we win in November and that 3 Republican justices who are over 70 retire while Joe Biden is president. I mean, it's unrealistic that the strategy is just never lose elections again. At least with AOC, you see some effort to try and make this into a politically salient issue. There's nothing stopping Dick Durbin and the Senate Judiciary Committee from holding hearings, use the subpoena power. These are incredibly unpopular justices by any measure, and we seem to have lost this ability to create a political narrative that actually engages voters and gets them out to vote. The expectation these people will keep turning out if Democrats do nothing is delusional to me.
Yeah, I mean, Democrats have no strategy to deal with this kind of thing. But in the first place, running on prosecuting Trump, I have some skepticism that this is the issue to bring undecided Americans into the fold. I think the hush money trial had a very slight, if anything, impact on Trump's popularity. There's so many trials, I think it's difficult for the American public who's not paying close attention to keep up. I think it's absolutely that Trump's conduct relating to January 6th is a weakness in his reelection campaign. It is something that even makes many Republicans uncomfortable. Is it the most salient issue for very many people in America? I don't think the polls are showing that very much. People are concerned about inflation and immigration and the state of the economy in general, maybe some of the Middle East, maybe whether Joe Biden is even capable of being president for 4 more years, given the debate performance we saw. The inability to the fact that, we can't prosecute him before the election. Well, then was it just political in the first place?
Well, here's the reality, is that there are a few things going for Democrats on this. One is that the Supreme Court is historically unpopular. Yeah. Only about a quarter of independents, Democrats and Republicans.
And so is Congress.
But no one more so than the Supreme Court.
I don't know if that's
and the reality is, on the issues the Supreme Court's decided on things like abortion, on things like immunity, voters support the Democratic position. But they can't be expected to come out to the polls on these issues if Democrats themselves aren't treating them as major issues. The expectation that these voters are just going to realize on their own that these issues can only be solved by re-electing a Democrat and enhancing the Democratic majorities in Congress is just lazy politics. I mean, we have been schooled for decades from Republicans who are experts at turning issues into theater that engages and mobilizes voters. I would love to see any of that, especially on an issue that we say correctly is so defining, not just for the next election, but for the future of the country. I mean, Donald Trump realistically has the chance to replace multiple liberal justices in a second term. That is not something to be underplayed. And this commitment to institutionalism that Joe Biden is showing, in a sense, underplays the seriousness of the threat to the institution.
I would say that decades ago, conservatives got very serious about molding the court in accordance with their vision. They got sick of, it was the case that what I think was Eisenhower, Nixon, appointed so many nominally Republican judges and justices that ended up having for the time, very liberal records.
Yep.
Were not, committed to Federalist Society kind of ideological views, and that was very irritating that happened so many times. And so conservatives got serious about it. Like, no, we are going to hold our candidates' feet to the fire, and we are going to make them promise to appoint judges who will actually rule in accordance with the philosophy we want. Of course, we remember when Bush tried to appoint Harriet Miers, someone with no real history of a conservative legal philosophy, and conservatives said, no, absolutely not, no way, we will not let this happen again, no. And he backpedaled, and then Samuel Alito ended up with that seat. Conservatives put pressure on Republicans to actually get what they want, and over time, it has worked.
There is sort of a terrible brilliance to it. I mean, you're right. This is a multi-generational effort that's been taken very seriously behind the scenes. It's occurred when Republicans have been in majority. It's occurred when they've been in minority. They have been remarkably consistent of ideology over best government, over best practices, over country. And there is no such discipline in the Democratic Party. I compare it almost to Nixon after his loss to Johnson. That there is, or Nixon after his loss to Kennedy, where there is no governing democratic legal ideology anymore. There's become a comfort here, and a lot of these things were taken for granted. The idea that Roe could never be overturned, the idea that the administrative state was a permanent fixture of American government. And this has been proven woefully wrong this term, and the fact that Democrats are surprised shows that many of them just weren't paying attention.
Well, but would be running on an expansion or a maintenance of the administrative state be a winning campaign message? I don't think so. A lot of Americans are very frustrated with the administrative state and how it, I would argue, hamstrings progress, how it stops, business regulations strangling small business, the economic situation in this country, from everything else going on. A lot of our COVID-era rules, we remember those, made by not by democratic forces, but by administrators who'd been in power for decades and had not changed with the administrations changing, that there's very little accountability. I think the American people, this is true of the conservative movement at least, and this is their major issue now, and I think you see at least some support for it among moderates as well, that the administrative state has come out of control, that is no longer constrained by democratic forces whatsoever, that Congress has totally failed on its legislative job, has no interest in being a legislature, has no interest in doing anything but being on TV, frankly. And so so the president has unitary power to make policy that is then actually revised by the administrative agencies, sometimes subject to the disapproval of the Supreme Court. And that's how our government actually functions. It functions without Congress doing anything.
Well, the challenge here is, you're right, Congress is a terrible legislative body. Last year they passed 27 bills. Now we want to put them in charge of actually authorizing hundreds and hundreds of federal regulations that they're now going to need to authorize. I take the opposite view entirely. I think one of the things that's driven American exceptionalism, certainly American economic growth, is the consistency of our rules and regulations for business and investors. You know what the rules are going to be when you start a business, when you engage with this country economically. Now, when you take that away from agencies, you put it back into a highly politicized environment, you put it back into district courts, suddenly all of that certainty disappears. And you have an environment that is much more challenging to predict business-wise. It's no surprise that the stock market dipped significantly after this ruling. These businesses understand that that predictability has been their greatest asset. And now you're handing it to a Congress that can't even tie its own shoes. That's a huge risk.
Well, we will continue to discuss this decision this week. More Rising coming up next.